Hello everyone, we are here to talk about the federated SSO enhancements that is included with Clarity 15.9.1. So as part of this section, we will be covering three new topics. The first one is the new UI to manage SAML settings within Clarity. The second is the new Sync SaaS user job that is available for our Broadcom Clarity SaaS customers. And the last is the introduction of secondary email within Clarity. Why is this important? So in 15.9, the previous release of Clarity, we had introduced the ability for Clarity to support federated SSO, SAML connection directly. That connection settings could be done using the REST APIs that were provided as part of the product. In 15.9.1, we have now made the same settings available as a UX that customers or administrators can go into the admin section of Modern UX and configure the same values from there. In addition, customers that are in the Broadcom SaaS that have enabled federated SSO for their end users to authenticate wanted to create test accounts in our Okta system. They were not able to do so because in our Okta, the requirement is that the email address is also your username. So when you're creating a test account and you want to share the email address between those multiple test accounts, primarily for the multi-factor authentication, then the users were not able to do so. So to address that, we are now introducing a secondary email address for all users in Clarity. The secondary email address will be available for on-premise and SaaS, but its primary purpose is for our Broadcom SaaS users. So the new SAML configuration UI is available under the authentication and keys within the Modern UX administration section. There are two tabs that are made available. The first one is the SAML configuration. This is used to configure the SAML metadata, as well as you can also use this to link to any encryption certificate that if you're using an encrypted SAML, as well as you can use this to export the service provider metadata. The second tab that's available is the certificates. This certificates allows the ability to manage the certificates for encrypting the SAML request itself. If you are importing the SAML configuration using the import option, and that SAML configuration has encryption certificates as part of the same file, we will automatically read that. We will then configure the SAML configuration based on that file, as well as create an entry in the certificates and link the two together. So the import functionality will perform all of those actions for you in a single step. Importing the SAML configuration can happen using the Import Identity Provider Metadata button. The SAML configuration tab is based on the new grid, so you have the option to view different columns, change the layout, provide filters, and so on. After importing the IDP metadata, the admin has the option to make changes to those settings. So if there is something that needs to be slightly tweaked after the import, using this common grid, the admins have the option to modify some of that setting information. The SAML configuration can also be used to export the service provider metadata that will be then used by the IDP itself. For the certificate management tab, you do have the option to manage multiple certificates. Each certificate will have its own start and expiration date that you can control, as well as an active flag. If the certificate is not active or has expired, then that certificate will not be available for you to link to a SAML configuration. Customers that are with the Broadcom SaaS that have enabled federated SSO always had the option for the end user to be able to connect to Clarity, and if that user did not exist in our middle security layer, then we would just create those users just in time. However, if the customer had partners or contractors that will come and work in their instance, then they would have to manually log into our security layer, which is Okta in this case, as a tenant admin, manually define all the settings for those contractors and then grant them access. In 15.9.1, we are going to make it easier for our customers by this new job, which is the Sync SaaS user job. This job will allow the customers to synchronize Clarity users with Okta. This job will basically, primary reason would be is to configure all the non-federated users to be configured in Okta, but the customers also can run it for their federated users if they don't want to use the just-in-time. The job will add Clarity user to the Broadcom Okta as well as add them to the Okta group that grants them access to that customer's specific environment. Customers do not need to go to Okta for user management outside of deactivating that user. The way the job runs is when executed, it'll check which all Clarity user that have not been synchronized since the past execution. It'll try to see if that user is in the form of an email address, then it'll process it. If it is not in the form of an email address, we will just skip it. If the user is then not created in Okta, we will create the user in Okta. We will check if the user belongs to the group, which means if the user exists but does not belong to the Okta group that grants them access to the environment, then we will add that user to that group. And if the user gets deactivated, we will then only deactivate it in Clarity. Then we will remove that user from the Okta group, thus revoking their right from the Clarity environment, but we will not deactivate them in Okta. And that is in case if that user is leveraging other Broadcom SaaS services, then we obviously cannot just deactivate the user, but we will revoke their access to the environment. This job will accept 3 parameters. 2 of these parameters are required. The first one is in the form of an email address. This is essentially saying which users do you want to synchronize with Okta. We will accept wildcard, or you can just run it for a specific domain. So for example, if I am a customer and I have ABC contractor that come and do work in my system, and I want all of their users that have been created in my Clarity to be added to Okta, I can just go in and say *@abc.com. When I run this job will find all the users that have the username with asterisk or that begins or have the domain of @abc.com. We will take those users and process them in Okta. You can have multiple domains added, separated by a comma, so the job is very flexible from that perspective. The second parameter that is required is the notify users. This parameter is primarily for The reason that if I am adding a user into Okta the first time, then Okta needs to send a registration email to that user. By setting this flag to yes, we will then enable Okta to go ahead and send that new user an email to register themselves or complete the registration. If you set the flag to no, then we will only create the user in Okta and not send them the Okta registration. The easy way of remembering what option should be picked here for the notify user is that in my federated system, for my non-federated user, I should set this value to yes, such as my contractors and partners, so that they will then get a notification to register in Okta. In the same system, for my end users that are part of my IDP, for those users, I should set this value to no, because I don't want them to get any Okta registration. They are going to log in using my company provided IDP. The last option is the full or partial, which means full will execute for all users in the system that have username in the email format, and partial means only run for the users between the last execution and the current execution. The next enhancement that's added is the secondary email that has been added into Clarity. The primary use case for this is within my Broadcom SaaS. I have a federated environment and I want to create multiple test accounts. And for those test accounts, I want to share a common email so that I will get all the registration notifications or multi-factor authentication notifications. Then I can do that using this secondary email. In this case, I would create my username and my email address to be my the dummy account. But the secondary email address is what I will set to my email address. Then I will run the sync SaaS user job. And when that job executes, it'll create the user in Okta based on those three values: the username, the email address, and the secondary email address. And the user registration notification will go to the secondary email address. One thing to note is the secondary email address, like I mentioned, is primarily only for the Okta registration and notification. The Clarity notifications, such as the notifications that are sent out by Clarity, for example, if you're added to a project, if your timesheet is due, all of those out-of-the-box Clarity notifications will still go to the user's email address. The secondary email address is not used for that reason, for that purpose. So with that, let's go in and see how we can set up the secondary email address as well as the SAML configuration. So I'm here in Clarity 15.9.1. And the first thing that I am going to see is the secondary email address that is available to me. So I'm in the administration resource section, and I am going to look at my user definition. And in here, you can see the email address. And then here is the secondary email address. So this is where I can configure. For users or customers that are upgrading, these values by default is just set to none or null. And then the administrators can populate this to any value that they would like. All right, next, let's go into our modern UX and let's look at the configuration for my SAML. So here I am in the modern UX, and if I want to configure the SAML connection between my Clarity environment and my IDP, then I can do that by going into administration under authentication and keys. I see that there are two new tabs right here. So the first one is the SAML configuration. And here I have a SAML configuration already defined. In this SAML configuration, just like any other Clarity grid, these are all editable attributes that I can review. I can populate additional or tweak the information. I can add or remove all the columns. So these are the list of all the attributes that are available. Someone who's an expert in setting up SAML would know what each one of these attributes are and their required values. And you can also use the details to configure the same information. To make it easy for our administrators, we also have the option to import the IDP metadata. And in that case, once the SSO admin creates the SAML configuration, exports that artifact out, we can take that file and we can import it into Clarity. At the time of import, there are two information required. One is the configuration identifier. This is the unique ID. And the second is the configuration name, which is the name of your the entry that you're making in here. So I'm just going to give my name and my ID, and I'm going to click on upload. I have a value or a IDP exported meta file that I'm going to select. And when I click on done, it uploads that value. So right here, you can see it created the demo instance. It sets it to active because that is the one that I just imported. And in my file, I also had the encryption key. So I can see that under the X509 certificate, there is a link to the IDP, the demo key, which if I go into the certificates, here is that entry that was just pulled in based on the file. So that import does all actions for you in one transaction. In the certificates tab, as you can see, I have multiple encryption keys. These keys have their own start and expiration date, as well as the certificate itself and the active flag. Any key that is either expired or not active will not be available for me to link to my SAML configuration. So you saw that there were 4 keys in the certificates, but when I go here, I only see 2. The 2 inactive ones are not available for me to see. As I can modify some of these values based on how they should be set up. Once that is done, then I need to generate my SP initiated metadata so that can be then configured back into the IDP, and I can do that by just doing a right mouse click and saying export service provider metadata. This will generate the file for me that I can then give to my SSO user. That concludes the demo for the federated SSO enhancement.